Look at this title carefully. The Nigerian Crime Myth. Not Nigerian crime, not Nigerian criminals, the Nigerian Crime Myth. Because this series is not going to pretend that Nigerians don't commit crimes. They do. Just as people from every country, every continent, and every social class commit crimes. The question we are asking is much bigger. How did the criminal behavior of a relatively small number of Nigerians become powerful enough to influence how millions of Nigerians are perceived around the world? Think about that. There are more than 200 million Nigerians. Among them are doctors saving lives, engineers building infrastructure, scientists conducting research, teachers educating children, entrepreneurs creating businesses, artists creating culture, and ordinary people simply trying to live decent lives. Yet mention the word Nigerian in certain parts of the world, and what immediately comes to mind for some people? Scam, fraud, drugs, corruption. Why? Where did that image come from? Who reinforced it? What evidence supports it? And perhaps most importantly, is the image proportionate to the reality? This series is going to follow the evidence. We are going to examine crime statistics, organized crime, drug markets, financial crime, cybercrime, intelligence operations, media narratives, and the economics behind criminal networks. But we are also going to examine something even more powerful: perception. Because sometimes, the most valuable thing a society can lose isn't money. It is reputation. And once a reputation becomes attached to an entire nationality, innocent people can end up paying the price for crimes they never committed. So this isn't simply a series about Nigeria. It is about how stereotypes are created, how they become accepted as truth, and what happens when we finally interrogate them. So let us begin with one uncomfortable question. Did a few criminals really define 230 million people? Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. Before we look at statistics, crime reports, media coverage, or historical events, we need to establish the question that sits underneath this entire investigation. Can an entire nation be judged by the actions of a minority? It sounds obvious. The answer should be no. But in practice, that is exactly how stereotypes work. We take the behavior of some individuals, attach it to their nationality, repeat the association often enough, and eventually the association begins to feel like a fact. A Nigerian commits fraud. The story becomes, Nigerians are scammers. A Nigerian is arrested for drug trafficking. The story becomes, Nigerians are involved in drugs. But notice what has happened. We have moved from describing the behavior of an individual to describing the character of an entire population. That is a massive logical leap. And this is where our investigation begins. But there is another important point. We are not going to answer this question simply by saying that's racist, or the media is against Nigerians. Those may become parts of the discussion, but they are not our evidence. Look at the sentence at the bottom of the slide. We'll answer it with a mechanism, not an opinion. That is the methodology of this series. We're going to ask, how does a stereotype actually become a national reputation? Who creates the association? Who amplifies it? What gets reported? What doesn't? How does confirmation bias work? And when we compare Nigeria with other countries and other forms of crime, does the evidence actually support the reputation? Because there is a difference between saying, Nigerian criminals exist. Of course they do. And saying, Nigerians are criminals. Those are completely different claims. The first is a statement about individuals. The second is a statement about an entire people. And throughout this episode, we're going to test the second claim. Not emotionally, not defensively, empirically. Because if the evidence supports the stereotype, we should be prepared to confront that. But if the evidence doesn't support it, then we need to ask why the stereotype became so powerful in the first place. Say the word Nigerian to a stranger. Now imagine you're having this conversation somewhere in the world where the person knows very little about Nigeria. You say, Nigeria. What comes to mind? Afrobeats? Nollywood? Lagos? Jollof rice? Africa's largest economy? Perhaps the remarkable Nigerian diaspora? Or, as this slide deliberately challenges us to consider, a scam email? That is uncomfortable. And we shouldn't pretend the association doesn't exist. Nigeria has a real history of advance fee fraud, commonly associated with 419, and Nigerians have been involved in serious criminal activity, both at home and abroad. Those facts must be acknowledged. If we are going to challenge a narrative, we cannot begin by denying reality. But acknowledging a problem is not the same as accepting a stereotype, and that distinction is at the heart of this entire series. Think about what happens psychologically. A person encounters a Nigerian scammer. Then another story appears in the news. Then another. The nationality gets mentioned. The stories are memorable. The thousands of ordinary interactions that don't involve crime are invisible. Eventually, the brain begins to make an association. Nigerian right-pointing arrow scam. But here's the question we need to investigate. How representative is that association? If millions of Nigerians are not criminals, why does the criminal minority have such extraordinary power over the perception of the majority? And this is where we move beyond outrage and into evidence. Because the association is real. It exists in popular culture. It exists in online conversations. It exists in policing and fraud awareness. And it can affect innocent Nigerians, traveling, studying, working, opening bank accounts, doing business, or simply introducing themselves. But an association being real does not automatically make the underlying assumption true. That is the distinction we are going to examine throughout this episode. We will trace where the association came from. We will examine how it was amplified. We will look at the actual scale of Nigerian involvement in different categories of crime. And then we will put Nigeria into a global comparison. Because we cannot meaningfully ask whether Nigerians are unusually criminal without asking, compared with whom? Compared with which countries? Measured by what? Per capita? Total cases? Arrests? Convictions? Economic losses? Organized criminal activity? Cybercrime? Drug trafficking? Financial crime? The metric matters. And so does the denominator. The objective isn't to replace one stereotype with another. It is to replace an assumption with a question. And then replace the question with evidence. Where did the Nigerian crime label come from? And when we examine the evidence, does it actually hold up? If we want to understand how a stereotype becomes powerful, we need to understand the mechanism behind it. Because stereotypes rarely appear from nowhere. They are built through repetition, and two forces are particularly important here. The first is confirmation bias. Once someone believes that Nigerians are associated with fraud, they become more likely to notice information that confirms that belief. A Nigerian scam story appears in the news. There it is. Another Nigerian is arrested. I knew it. But what happens to the millions of Nigerians who commit no crime whatsoever? Nothing. Their normal behavior isn't news. Their honesty isn't news. Their professional success isn't news. Their ordinary lives don't confirm or challenge the stereotype strongly enough to attract attention. So the brain begins collecting evidence selectively. But then something else happens. Media repetition. A story appears once. Then another publication reports it. Then television discusses it. Then social media repeats it. Then someone encounters the same association again months later. Eventually, familiarity begins to feel like truth. And this is crucial. Repetition is not evidence. Hearing something 100 times does not make it 100 times more accurate. Now imagine these two forces working together. A person already believes Nigerians are associated with fraud. The media repeatedly presents stories involving Nigerian fraud suspects. Those stories reinforce the person's existing belief. That strengthened belief makes the next Nigerian fraud story even more memorable. And the cycle continues. Belief, right-pointing arrow attention, right-pointing arrow repetition, right-pointing arrow stronger belief. That is how a stereotype can become self-reinforcing. But we need to be careful here. This does not mean that every report about Nigerian crime is fabricated, or that journalists deliberately created the stereotype. There are genuine criminal networks. There are genuine victims. There are genuine crimes that deserve investigation. The question is different. Does the amount of attention given to a particular category of crime accurately represent the behavior of an entire population? That is what we're going to test. Because once we understand the mechanism, we can stop arguing about feelings and start examining the evidence. And that brings us to the next question. What happens when we stop looking at individual stories and start looking at the numbers? There is something deeply human happening here. We don't experience the world like cameras. We don't simply record everything we see. Our brains filter information, and one of the strongest filters is what we already believe. Imagine someone already believes that Nigerians are associated with online fraud. They encounter a news story about a Nigerian fraud suspect. That story immediately stands out. But on the same day, they might encounter 10 Nigerians who are doctors, students, engineers, business owners, or ordinary working people. Those encounters don't fit the existing belief, so they are less memorable. This is the first part of the mechanism. We selectively notice what confirms the story we already have in our heads. Then something even more powerful happens. We remember confirming cases more vividly. Ask someone why they believe Nigerians are scammers, and they may immediately remember a particular story, a documentary, a personal experience, or an email they received. But ask them to remember the millions of Nigerians they've encountered, who were not scammers. That's much harder. The confirming examples have become psychologically significant. The contradictory examples become background noise. And then we reach the third stage. Each confirmation strengthens the schema. The next time that person encounters the word Nigerian, Their brain is already primed. They don't start from zero. They start with a prediction. And that prediction influences what they notice next. This is how stereotypes can become self-reinforcing without anyone consciously deciding to become prejudiced. But here's the important warning for our investigation. Confirmation bias doesn't belong exclusively to people who hold negative views about Nigerians. Nigerians can experience it too. If we believe the world deliberately hates Nigerians, we can selectively notice every negative story and ignore evidence that complicates that conclusion. So we must apply the same standard to ourselves. That is what makes this investigation credible. We're not here to prove what we already believe. We're here to test it. And that brings us to a critical distinction. A stereotype can be psychologically powerful without being statistically representative. The fact that we can remember examples does not tell us how common the underlying behavior actually is. For that, we need something much harder to manipulate: the evidence. There is another mechanism that can turn an association into something that feels like common knowledge: repetition. We have all experienced this. You hear a claim once, and you are uncertain. You hear it again, and it sounds familiar. You hear it 10 more times, from different people and different sources, and eventually you stop asking whether it is true. You simply recognize it. And recognition can easily be mistaken for truth. Researchers have studied this phenomenon as the reiteration effect. Repeated exposure to a claim can increase its perceived truth, even when the repetition itself provides no new evidence. That distinction is critical. Repetition is not verification. Imagine one news report saying that a Nigerian national has been arrested for fraud. That is a story about an individual. Now imagine similar headlines appearing repeatedly over 10 years. Different people, different cases, different publications. The individual cases may all be genuine, but something else is happening in the audience's mind. The repeated association begins to create a mental shortcut. Nigeria right-pointing arrow fraud. Eventually, the original evidence behind individual stories can disappear from memory. What remains is the association. And this is where national stereotypes become extremely powerful. One story is a story. 100 stories can become a perception. And a perception repeated often enough can become something people describe as what everybody knows. But notice the problem. Nobody necessarily went back and asked, what percentage of Nigerians actually engage in this behavior? How does it compare with other nationalities? How many stories were there because the behavior was unusually common? And how many were there because the stories were particularly newsworthy? Those are completely different questions. This is why throughout this series we have to separate frequency of reporting from frequency of behavior. A crime can receive enormous media attention without representing the typical behavior of the population associated with it. And that applies far beyond Nigeria. It is a general principle of how information spreads. So when somebody says everybody knows Nigerians are scammers, our response shouldn't simply be anger. It should be, what exactly do you mean by everybody? And what is the evidence? Because if the claim has become powerful primarily through repetition, then the next step is obvious. We need to stop counting headlines and start examining data. There is another mechanism that can turn an association into something that feels like common knowledge: repetition. We have all experienced this. You hear a claim once, and you are uncertain. You hear it again, and it sounds familiar. You hear it 10 more times, from different people and different sources, and eventually you stop asking whether it is true. You simply recognize it. And recognition can easily be mistaken for truth. Researchers have studied this phenomenon as the reiteration effect. Repeated exposure to a claim can increase its perceived truth, even when the repetition itself provides no new evidence. That distinction is critical. Repetition is not verification. Imagine one news report saying that a Nigerian national has been arrested for fraud. That is a story about an individual. Now imagine similar headlines appearing repeatedly over 10 years. Different people, different cases, different publications. The individual cases may all be genuine, but something else is happening in the audience's mind. The repeated association begins to create a mental shortcut. Nigeria right-pointing arrow fraud. Eventually, the original evidence behind individual stories can disappear from memory. What remains is the association. And this is where national stereotypes become extremely powerful. One story is a story. 100 stories can become a perception. And a perception repeated often enough can become something people describe as what everybody knows. But notice the problem. Nobody necessarily went back and asked, what percentage of Nigerians actually engage in this behavior? How does it compare with other nationalities? How many stories were there because the behavior was unusually common? And how many were there because the stories were particularly newsworthy? Those are completely different questions. This is why throughout this series we have to separate frequency of reporting from frequency of behavior. A crime can receive enormous media attention without representing the typical behavior of the population associated with it. And that applies far beyond Nigeria. It is a general principle of how information spreads. So when somebody says everybody knows Nigerians are scammers, our response shouldn't simply be anger. It should be, what exactly do you mean by everybody? And what is the evidence? Because if the claim has become powerful primarily through repetition, then the next step is obvious. We need to stop counting headlines and start examining data. Before we apply this mechanism to Nigeria, I want to test it somewhere else. And I have chosen a subject that makes the mechanism particularly clear: mental illness and violence. Why? Because this gives us some distance. We're not emotionally invested in defending or attacking a particular nationality. We can simply observe how a stereotype develops. Consider the association: mental illness, right-pointing arrow; dangerous, right-pointing arrow; violence. Most people understand that these are not interchangeable concepts. Yet after a highly publicized violent incident involving someone described as mentally ill, those two ideas can become psychologically connected. One story appears. Another follows. The media reports the person's mental health history. People remember the shocking event far more vividly than the millions of people with mental health conditions who are not violent. And gradually the exceptional case begins to feel representative. This is exactly the mechanism we have just described. Confirmation bias tells us to notice cases that fit the association. Repetition makes the association increasingly familiar. And familiarity can eventually feel like evidence. But now ask a different question. Does the stereotype accurately describe the population? That requires data, not headlines. And this is the discipline we need to bring into our discussion of Nigeria. We must never confuse "this happens" with "this is typical." Those are completely different statements. There is also an ethical reason for doing this carefully. When we repeatedly associate a vulnerable population with dangerous behavior, the stereotype can have consequences far beyond the original story. It can influence how people are treated, how institutions respond to them, and how society perceives millions of innocent individuals. So this case study isn't really about mental illness. It is about how exceptional events can become representative in the public imagination. And once we understand that mechanism, in a context that isn't specifically Nigerian, we can turn the lens back toward our own subject. Because the uncomfortable question becomes, could the same psychological process be operating when the world thinks about Nigerians in crime? Not necessarily. But that is precisely why we investigate. We are not going to assume the answer. We're going to test the mechanism. Now we get to something extremely important: the gap between what people believe and what the evidence actually tells us. Look at these two numbers, 61%, and then 4%. According to the research cited here, roughly 61% of respondents considered a person described as having schizophrenia likely to be violent, while clinical research has estimated that serious mental illness accounts for only a small proportion of violent crime. That is a dramatic perception gap. And notice what it demonstrates. The public perception isn't necessarily being created from a careful assessment of the underlying statistics. It can be created from visibility, memorable incidents, repetition, and association. A highly publicized violent incident involving someone with a mental health diagnosis is memorable. Millions of people with the same diagnosis who never commit violence are not. So the exceptional case becomes psychologically larger than the ordinary reality. This is precisely why we need to be careful when discussing Nigeria. Suppose someone says, "I've seen so many stories about Nigerian scammers. Nigerians must be particularly involved in fraud." That statement sounds like an argument from evidence, but it may actually be an argument from exposure. They are describing what they have seen, not necessarily what is statistically representative. And those are two very different things. There is another lesson here. We should not use this slide to argue that mental illness has no relationship whatsoever with violence. That would simply create another distortion. The point is that a genuine relationship can still be dramatically exaggerated in public perception. That distinction is essential. Because our objective isn't to replace one inaccurate narrative with another. It is to understand how the gap between perception and reality develops. And now we can bring the mechanism back to our central question. If repeated exposure can make people overestimate the connection between mental illness and violence, could repeated exposure to Nigerian crime stories similarly cause people to overestimate the prevalence of crime among Nigerians? That is the hypothesis. But a hypothesis isn't a conclusion. Now we need to test it against the Nigerian evidence. Now we come to the mechanism that can turn a relatively limited association into a much larger public perception, the media multiplier. Look at the left side. The slide tells us that roughly 4 in 10 news stories about mental illness connect it to violent behavior. Now look at the other side. The actual proportion of U.S. violence directly attributable to serious mental illness is estimated to be less than 5%. The important point isn't that these numbers are perfectly comparable. They aren't. They measure different things. The point is the direction of the gap. News coverage can disproportionately connect a particular population or condition with a dramatic behavior, even when that behavior represents only a small proportion of the underlying reality. Why does this happen? Because news is not a census of ordinary life. News is designed to identify events that are unusual, consequential, dramatic, or socially important. A person with mental illness living peacefully for 30 years isn't normally a headline. A violent incident involving someone with a mental health diagnosis can become national news. So the audience repeatedly encounters the exceptional case, while rarely encountering the ordinary case. That creates what we might call a visibility distortion. And this matters enormously when we return to Nigeria. Imagine that 10 Nigerians commit crimes today. Those cases may generate international headlines. But what about the millions of Nigerians who go to work, raise families, study, build businesses, practice medicine, teach, engineer, create music, and simply live their lives? Those lives don't generate the same news value. The result can be a dangerous mathematical illusion. The behavior that is most visible begins to look like the behavior that is most common. But visibility and prevalence are not the same thing. And I want to make one thing very clear. This isn't an argument against journalism. Crime should be reported. Victims deserve attention. Criminal networks should be exposed. The problem begins when audiences mistake the selection of events for a statistical representation of society. That distinction is fundamental. Because if the media can amplify a relatively small association until it becomes a dominant public perception, then we have to ask, has something similar happened with Nigeria? And if it has, who or what is doing the multiplying? So far, we have been talking about perception. But perception is not harmless. Labels have consequences. When we attach a dangerous characteristic to an entire group, people can begin to experience the consequences, even when they have done absolutely nothing wrong. The first consequence is stigma. Once a group becomes associated with a particular negative behavior, individuals can be judged before anyone knows anything about them. A Nigerian student, a Nigerian professional, a Nigerian entrepreneur, a Nigerian traveler. They can walk into a situation carrying a reputation they personally did nothing to create. The second consequence is policy. Public perception can influence what governments prioritize, how institutions assess risk, where resources are directed, and how aggressively certain groups are scrutinized. And that creates an important feedback loop. The more a group is treated as suspicious, the more attention is directed toward finding evidence of wrongdoing. More attention can produce more detected cases. More detected cases can then appear to confirm the original assumption. That doesn't automatically mean the enforcement is illegitimate. It means we have to ask whether perception is influencing measurement itself. Then there is isolation. Imagine being judged before you have even spoken. Imagine your nationality creating suspicion before your character has had an opportunity to speak for you. That is the human cost of a national stereotype. And this is why our discussion matters. Because we are not simply debating whether Nigerians have a bad reputation. We are asking what happens when that reputation becomes a shortcut for judging individual human beings. Now bring this back to our central investigation. The mechanism we've just examined doesn't belong exclusively to mental illness. It can potentially operate around race, nationality, religion, class, neighborhoods, or almost any social category. A real incident occurs. It receives attention. The association is repeated. The public becomes familiar with it. Familiarity becomes expectation. Expectation becomes judgment. And eventually, the label can begin to shape reality itself. That is the pattern we are now going to trace onto Nigeria. But remember our standard. We are not going to deny Nigerian crime. We are going to ask whether the national label accurately represents the underlying population. Because there is a world of difference between some Nigerians commit crimes and Nigerians are criminals. The first can be demonstrated. The second requires something much bigger. And that is the claim we are putting under the microscope. We have deliberately spent the last several slides talking about something other than Nigeria. That was intentional, because if we had started with Nigeria, some viewers would immediately become defensive. Some would say, this is anti-Nigerian. Others might say, you're just trying to defend Nigerians. And both reactions would miss the point. So instead, we stepped outside the Nigerian case. We looked at how confirmation bias works. We looked at how repetition can increase perceived truth. We looked at how media coverage can amplify exceptional events. And we looked at what happens when a population becomes associated with a particular behavior. Now we bring the same mechanism back to Nigeria. And this time, we don't need to change the rules. The same questions apply. What are the original events? How frequently are they reported? How often is Nigerian nationality emphasized? What happens to those stories after they are repeated? What happens to the millions of Nigerians whose lives contradict the stereotype? And most importantly, does the evidence support the size of the reputation? Because this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable. There really are Nigerian fraudsters. There really are Nigerian drug traffickers. There really are Nigerian criminal networks. We are not going to hide any of that. But the existence of Nigerian criminals does not automatically establish that Nigerians as a population are unusually criminal. That conclusion requires evidence. And this is where we have to resist another temptation. We cannot respond to a negative stereotype by pretending Nigeria has no problems. That would destroy our credibility. Instead, we are going to do something much more powerful. We are going to acknowledge the problem, measure it, compare it, understand its history, and then ask whether the label accurately describes the people carrying it. Because there is a profound difference between confronting crime and condemning a nationality. So from this point forward, the question changes. We're no longer asking, are there Nigerian criminals? We already know the answer. The question is, how did Nigerian criminals become a symbol for Nigerians? And once we understand that, we can finally investigate whether the symbol matches reality. Most people don't need me to explain the joke. I'm a Nigerian prince. I need your help transferring millions of dollars. You already know where that story is going, and that's precisely why this example is so powerful. The joke has become so familiar that the punchline can almost be completed automatically. But that should make us stop and ask a more serious question. How did this become so deeply associated with Nigeria? Because the phrase Nigerian prince isn't simply a joke anymore. It has become shorthand for an entire category of fraud. And once a stereotype becomes part of popular culture, something interesting happens. People can encounter it without knowing its history. They know the joke, but not necessarily where the association came from. So this is where we need to separate two things. There is the joke version, and then there is the documented version. The joke says, Nigerian prince equals scammer. But history asks, when did advance fee fraud emerge? What did 419 actually refer to? Where were these schemes conducted? How did they evolve? How did international communications technology change them? And how did the Nigerian connection become so prominent in global consciousness? Those are answerable questions, and that's exactly how we're going to approach them. We are not going to invent a convenient origin story. We are going to follow the paper trail. Court records, government investigations, academic research, historical reporting, and documented changes in fraud patterns. Because if we want to challenge a stereotype, we need to understand its actual history, not simply dislike the stereotype. There's also a deeper question here. Why did the phrase become Nigerian prince rather than simply online scammer? That distinction matters. A criminal tactic became associated with a nationality, and then popular culture transformed that association into a joke. The joke then reinforced the association, and the association made future stories easier to recognize. Remember our mechanism. An incident attracts attention. Attention creates repetition. Repetition creates association. Association becomes a stereotype. Now we are going to trace that mechanism historically, because the question isn't whether 419 existed. It did. The question is, how did 419 become Nigeria in the global imagination? And once we understand that history, we can finally begin separating the criminal phenomenon from the national identity attached to it. Here is where we need to challenge one of the most persistent assumptions about the Nigerian prince scam. The scam is strongly associated with Nigeria today, but the underlying technique did not originate in Nigeria. The history is much older. Go back to the Spanish prisoner confidence trick, documented in Europe long before the modern Nigerian 419 phenomenon. The basic psychological formula was already there. A stranger presents an extraordinary opportunity, promises access to a much larger fortune, and asks the victim to provide money first. The technology changes. The story changes. The nationality attached to the story can change. But the underlying psychology remains remarkably similar. Then we move forward to the 20th century. By the 1970s and 1980s, variants of advance fee fraud were being conducted in Nigeria through physical letters and later fax communications. Research describes the consolidation of what became known as Nigerian advance fee fraud during the mid-1980s. And this is where Nigeria genuinely enters the story. Nigeria's economic crisis following the oil boom created conditions in which some individuals adapted existing confidence schemes to new circumstances. The scam evolved, became increasingly sophisticated, and eventually acquired the label 419, referring to the relevant section of Nigerian law. Then came the internet, and everything changed. A letter that could reach dozens of people could now become an email capable of reaching thousands, or potentially millions. A geographically limited confidence trick became a borderless criminal enterprise, and suddenly the Nigerian association traveled with it. This is the critical distinction. We can acknowledge that Nigeria became an important center of a particular form of advance fee fraud, without claiming that Nigeria invented fraud itself. Those are two completely different historical statements. And that distinction matters because the stereotype eventually compressed a complicated history into 3 words. Nigerian prince. The centuries of confidence tricks disappeared. The economic history disappeared. The technological transformation disappeared. The criminal networks disappeared. What remained was a nationality. Nigeria became the label for the scam. And that is exactly what our investigation is trying to understand. Not whether 419 existed. It absolutely did. But how a particular criminal phenomenon became powerful enough to become a shorthand for an entire nation. The timeline gives us our first major lesson. The crime may have a history, but the stereotype has a history too. and those two histories are not necessarily the same. We have established that the technique itself was not invented by Nigeria. So the next question becomes much more interesting. Why did Nigeria become so strongly associated with it? To answer that, we have to stop looking at the crime in isolation and look at the environment in which it developed. The first part is economic context. During the 1970s, Nigeria experienced a dramatic oil boom. Oil revenues transformed government spending, created new expectations, and produced significant economic expansion. But the boom did not last. When oil prices and revenues collapsed in the early 1980s, Nigeria entered a severe economic crisis. Unemployment increased, incomes fell, and opportunities became particularly difficult for many young and educated Nigerians. This context matters. It does not excuse criminal behavior. Economic hardship does not automatically produce criminals. Millions of Nigerians experienced the same crisis and remained honest. But if we want to understand why a particular criminal method expanded at a particular moment, we have to understand the conditions surrounding it. Then comes the second part, adaptation. Criminals don't operate outside technology. They adapt to whatever communication infrastructure is available. Letters, telephones, telex, fax machines, and eventually email. And the internet. The underlying confidence trick was old. The infrastructure was new. That distinction is important because it challenges a very tempting explanation. Nigerians are naturally fraudulent. There is nothing in this history that requires that conclusion. A more evidence-based explanation is much less dramatic. An existing criminal technique encountered a particular economic environment, a particular population of potential offenders, and new communication technologies, and some people adapted it for profit. That is a very different proposition. And notice something else. The vast majority of Nigerians experiencing the economic crisis did not become fraudsters. So even within the Nigerian case, we need to avoid simplistic explanations. Economic hardship can create incentives. Technology can create opportunities. Networks can provide knowledge. But individuals still make choices. This is important because our objective isn't to turn Nigerian criminals into victims. It is to understand the conditions that allowed a particular form of crime to develop. Understanding the mechanism is not excusing the crime. It is explaining it. And once we understand that distinction, we can ask the next question. What happened when this regional phenomenon met the global internet? Because that is where the Nigerian stereotype truly began to travel. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the Griot Wave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. There is an important detail hidden inside the joke about 419 that most people never hear. 419 is not simply a nickname for Nigerian scammers. The number comes from Section 419 of Nigeria's Criminal Code, dealing with obtaining property by false pretenses. Nigeria's own legal system criminalized the conduct that the world eventually came to associate with the term Lawcare Nigeria. That changes the way we should understand the word. Think about the irony. A number from Nigeria's own criminal law became an international label for fraud. In other words, Nigeria did not create a law celebrating the practice. It created a law against it. And the term eventually escaped its legal context and entered global popular language as shorthand for advance fee fraud. Academic research has specifically noted how 419 became part of the international vocabulary of email scams. Science Direct. That distinction matters because the joke compresses an entire legal and historical story into a single word. When someone says, "It's a 419 scam," they usually aren't thinking about the Nigerian Criminal Code. They're thinking, Nigeria. Fraud. Nigerian prince. The legal citation has effectively become a national stereotype. But there is another layer here. We should not use this fact to pretend that Nigeria had no serious fraud problem. It did. The Nigerian government has created specific legislation addressing advance fee fraud and related offenses, and institutions such as the EFCC explicitly recognize 419 as a serious financial crime. Lawcare Nigeria. So again, we are holding two truths together. The crime was real, and the stereotype became larger than the crime. That is the distinction this series keeps returning to. A criminal offense can be associated with a particular place without every person from that place becoming representative of the offense. And perhaps the most revealing part is what happened next. The number 419 traveled beyond Nigeria. It became global slang. It became a joke. It became a cultural reference. And eventually, people who had never read Nigeria's criminal code could recognize the number. The law became a label. And the label became a stereotype. Now we have to ask the next question. What happened when this Nigerian phenomenon entered the rapidly expanding global internet, and millions of potential victims became reachable from a computer? That is where the story gets much bigger. 2,300,000. Let that number sink in. 2.3 million letters. That is not a handful of scammers sending occasional letters. This was industrial-scale fraud. In 1998, U.S. postal officials seized approximately 2.3 million 419-style letters, passing through JFK Airport over a 3-month period. Contemporary and later research documents the scale of this pre-internet operation. And this is where we have to be intellectually honest. This was real. There was a substantial Nigerian-linked advance fee fraud industry. There were organized operations. There were victims. There was enormous volume. We should not minimize any of that simply because our objective is to challenge the stereotype. But now consider what the number actually tells us. It tells us that a particular criminal technique had reached extraordinary scale. It does not by itself tell us that Nigerians generally were criminals. That's the distinction we must keep making. Because two completely different conclusions can be drawn from the same evidence. The first is, there was a serious Nigerian advance fee fraud problem. The evidence supports that. The second is, therefore Nigerians are inherently dishonest. The evidence does not establish that. And there is another fascinating detail. Look at the technology involved. These were letters, paper, postage, forged documents, postal networks, telex and fax. This was happening before social media, before smartphones, before WhatsApp, before modern email marketing, and before the digital economy we know today. In other words, the phenomenon we now associate with the internet was already operating at extraordinary scale before the internet became its primary distribution system. That tells us something important about the economics of fraud. The technology doesn't create the underlying psychology. It amplifies it. The basic proposition remains. Create a believable story. Reach a large number of people. Convince a small percentage to respond. Make the return from successful victims much larger than the cost of contacting everyone else. The internet simply made that model dramatically cheaper and faster. And that is why this number matters. Not because it proves the stereotype, but because it gives us the scale of the phenomenon we are actually investigating. 2.3 million letters in 3 months. Now the question becomes, what happened when those millions of letters were replaced by millions of emails? That is where 419 stops being a regional fraud problem and becomes a global digital phenomenon. Something interesting happens when a criminal phenomenon becomes familiar enough. It stops being just a crime story. It becomes folklore. The Nigerian prince entered popular culture because the stereotype was already recognizable. Television shows such as 30 Rock and The Office used the trope precisely because audiences were expected to understand the joke immediately. The MIT press reader. And that is the transformation we need to pay attention to. At first there was a real criminal phenomenon. Then there were news reports about it. Then people began repeating the stories. Then comedians began referencing them. And eventually, you no longer needed to explain the scam. You could simply say, Nigerian prince. And everyone understood. That is when a criminal pattern becomes something much more powerful. A cultural shorthand. But here's the problem with cultural shorthand. It removes complexity. Nobody tells the joke by explaining the history of advance fee fraud. Nobody explains the economic conditions of 1980s Nigeria. Nobody discusses the evolution from postal letters to fax, email, and internet platforms. Nobody says some Nigerian criminal networks developed sophisticated advance fee schemes. The joke reduces everything to Nigerian equals scammer. And once that equation becomes part of popular culture, it becomes remarkably difficult to dislodge. Because comedy is sticky. A statistic might be forgotten tomorrow. A joke can survive for decades. And that is why the line on this slide matters. The joke outlived the facts. The underlying criminal environment changed. Technology changed. Fraud itself changed. Nigeria changed. The world changed. But the joke remained. And eventually, something that originally described a specific criminal practice became shorthand for an entire country. That is the final transformation. A specific crime pattern becomes a cultural stereotype. And this is where our investigation becomes bigger than 419. Because the question is no longer simply, did Nigerian fraud exist? Yes, it did. The question is, what happens when a genuine criminal history becomes the cultural identity of an entire population? That is a much more complicated question, and it is one we cannot answer simply by saying the stereotype is unfair. We need to examine what the stereotype hides, who gets excluded from the story, which Nigerians disappear from the narrative, and what happens when the world encounters Nigeria through its most memorable criminal stereotype, rather than through the full complexity of Nigerian society. Because once a joke becomes shorthand for a country, the joke is no longer just a joke. It has become a lens. And now we're going to examine what that lens allows people to see, and what it prevents them from seeing. Now we arrive at a moment where we have to be especially careful, because this slide is making a powerful point, but the evidence needs to be represented precisely. In June 2018, the FBI announced Operation Wirewire, a major international crackdown on business email compromise and related financial fraud. The operation produced 74 arrests internationally, 42 in the United States, 29 in Nigeria, and 3 across Canada, Mauritius, and Poland. So one correction to the graphic. The US figure should be 42, not 41. But the larger point remains interesting. The operation was not simply a story about Nigerians defrauding Americans. It was an international criminal ecosystem. The FBI described BEC as a sophisticated form of cyber-enabled financial fraud involving businesses and individuals, with perpetrators and networks operating across multiple countries. And that matters because the popular stereotype often compresses a complicated transnational crime into a single national identity: Nigerian scammer. But look at what the actual investigation reveals. American arrests, Nigerian arrests, arrests in Canada, Mauritius, and Poland, international victims, international financial transfers, international money laundering routes. This is not a crime that fits neatly inside one national border. And there is another important point. We should not use these numbers to claim that Nigerians were somehow uninvolved. They clearly were. 29 people were arrested in Nigeria in this particular operation. The FBI also stated that many foreign nationals involved in BEC schemes belonged to transnational criminal organizations that originated in Nigeria but had spread internationally. So the honest conclusion is not, Nigeria has nothing to do with this. The honest conclusion is, Nigerian-linked criminal networks were significant participants in a much larger international criminal economy. That distinction is crucial, because if we want to challenge stereotypes, we cannot manipulate the evidence in the opposite direction. And there is an even bigger lesson here. Look at the scale of the crime itself. The FBI reported that Operation Wirewire disrupted or recovered approximately $14 million in fraudulent transfers, while the broader BEC problem involved billions of dollars in losses. So the story has evolved. We're no longer talking about a badly written letter from a fictional prince. We're talking about sophisticated financial deception involving businesses, compromised accounts, impersonation, and international money movement. The crime evolved, but the stereotype remained remarkably simple: Nigerian scam. And that is precisely the problem we are investigating. The evidence doesn't tell us that Nigerians are innocent of fraud. It tells us something more useful. The modern fraud economy is bigger, more sophisticated, and more international than the stereotype suggests. And once we understand that, we can finally ask the question this entire series is building toward. If crime has become global, why does the label remain national? Now we reach an important point in the story. If advance fee fraud were fundamentally a Nigerian characteristic, we would expect the phenomenon to remain overwhelmingly Nigerian. But it didn't. The technique traveled. And it traveled across borders long before the modern internet made global communication almost instantaneous. Official UK fraud guidance today explicitly warns that 419-style advance fee scams can involve South Africa, Ivory Coast, Togo, and Nigeria. South African authorities likewise acknowledge that, although the scams originated in Nigeria, syndicates in other countries became involved. Report fraud. Research and documented reporting have also identified advance fee activity connected with places including Ivory Coast, Togo, South Africa, the Netherlands, Spain, and Jamaica. And that changes the question. We are no longer dealing with a crime that belongs neatly to one country. We are dealing with a portable criminal business model. The basic formula can be transported. Find a target. Create a convincing story. Promise a much larger reward. Request an upfront payment. Exploit trust. Disappear. Or keep demanding more money. The technology changes. The language changes. The identity of the supposed official, businessman, lottery winner, or beneficiary changes. But the underlying mechanism remains remarkably consistent. And this is where the Nigerian stereotype becomes analytically problematic. Because Nigeria may have played a significant role in the history of advance fee fraud. That is a legitimate historical fact. But historical association is not the same thing as exclusive ownership. A criminal technique can emerge strongly in one environment, spread to other environments, and eventually become genuinely international. We see the same thing in many other forms of crime. Cybercrime crosses borders. Money laundering crosses borders. Drug trafficking crosses borders. Human trafficking crosses borders. Financial fraud crosses borders. Why would advance fee fraud be different? There is also an important warning here. We shouldn't simply create a new list of countries and say, look, they are scammers too. That would reproduce exactly the mistake this series is investigating. The point is not to transfer the stereotype from Nigeria to Ivory Coast, Togo, Jamaica, Spain, or anywhere else. The point is to demonstrate that criminal methods are not national personalities. They move wherever opportunity, technology, networks, and incentives allow them to move. So perhaps the better question isn't, which nationality owns the scam? It is, what conditions allow the scam to flourish? Once we ask that question, we stop thinking in stereotypes and start thinking in systems. Now we move from the history of 419 into the modern cybercrime environment. And this is where the old stereotype begins to break down even further. Look at the chart. The United States accounts for 25% of the reported source locations shown here. Russia accounts for 8%, France 7%, while the remaining 60% comes from everywhere else. And notice what is missing from the leading categories. Nigeria. That is significant, but we need to be precise about what this chart actually demonstrates. This is not proof that Nigerians don't participate in cybercrime. They do. And it is not proof that the United States or Russia is inherently more criminal. That would simply reproduce the same mistake we are trying to expose. What it demonstrates is something more fundamental. Modern cybercrime is geographically distributed. Cyber attacks can originate from compromised computers, criminal infrastructure, botnets, hosting providers, proxy networks, and actors operating across multiple jurisdictions. So an apparent country of origin does not necessarily identify the nationality of the person behind an attack. That distinction is crucial. An IP address is not a passport. A server location is not a criminal's nationality. And a cyber attack originating from a particular country does not mean the citizens of that country carried it out. In fact, modern cybercrime makes the idea of assigning crime neatly to national identities increasingly difficult. A criminal can be sitting in one country, use infrastructure located in another, target a victim in a third, move stolen money through a fourth, and recruit accomplices somewhere else entirely. That is a global criminal economy. And this brings us back to Nigeria. The old image was simple. Nigerian email becomes Nigerian scammer, which becomes Nigerian crime. But the modern digital environment is much more complicated. Cybercrime has become transnational, networked, and technologically sophisticated. And that means we have to ask whether continuing to describe an entire nationality through a particular historical form of fraud is analytically useful or simply outdated. There is another important lesson here. We should not replace the old stereotype with a new one. We are not saying, look, Americans and Russians are criminals. That would be absurd. We are saying, crime follows opportunity, infrastructure, incentives, and networks, not nationality alone. The internet has made that reality impossible to ignore. And if the crime itself has become global, why are we still explaining it through a national stereotype created decades ago? That is the question we need to carry into the next part of this investigation. We have now reached the point where we can put the two case studies side by side. On one side, mental illness. On the other, 419/Nigeria. Different subject, different history, different evidence. But look carefully at the pattern. First, there is an association. Then the association receives attention. Then it is repeated. Then repetition creates familiarity. And eventually, familiarity begins to look like reality. In the mental health example, public perception of violence can substantially exceed what the underlying evidence suggests. In the Nigerian case, the story is different. There is a genuine history of advance fee fraud and Nigerian involvement in some forms of organized fraud. But a historical association can evolve into something much broader. A global stereotype about an entire nationality. That distinction matters. We should not pretend that 419 was invented by the media. It wasn't. We should not pretend that Nigerians have never participated in fraud. They have. The more interesting question is, how did a real criminal phenomenon become a shorthand for an entire people? Look at the final row. Persists despite counter-evidence. That's the critical idea. Once a stereotype becomes established, evidence contradicting it doesn't necessarily make the stereotype disappear. A Nigerian doctor doesn't erase the stereotype. A Nigerian scientist doesn't erase it. A Nigerian entrepreneur doesn't erase it. Millions of ordinary Nigerians living honest lives don't erase it. Because those examples aren't necessarily entering the same information system. The criminal story is memorable. The stereotype is repeatable. And the ordinary reality is largely invisible. But there is an important lesson here for us as Nigerians too. We cannot simply say, the stereotype is false. We need to ask a harder question. What part of it is true? What part is exaggerated? And what part has been constructed by repetition? That is a much more intellectually honest position. And it protects us from falling into the same trap we are criticizing. Because our objective isn't to create an anti-Western stereotype to replace an anti-Nigerian one. It is to develop a better way of understanding crime. Individual behavior should not automatically become national character. And a handful of highly visible cases should not automatically become a statistical description of millions of people. So this synthesis gives us the framework for the rest of the series. Separate the crime from the nationality. Separate the headline from the data. Separate repetition from evidence. And then ask the question that really matters. Does the label describe reality, or has reality been reshaped by the label? We have now established something important. The association exists. The crimes exist. The history exists. But we have also seen that perception can become much larger than the underlying reality. So we arrive at the question that matters most. Why does the label persist? If the evidence is available, if millions of Nigerians clearly contradict the stereotype, if the world has changed dramatically since the early days of 419, why does the association remain so powerful? There isn't one simple answer. Part of it is memory. People remember emotionally powerful stories. Part of it is repetition. Once an association becomes familiar, every new example can reinforce it. Part of it is popular culture. The Nigerian prince has moved beyond fraud and become a global joke. And part of it is digital persistence. Old stories don't disappear. They remain searchable, shareable, and reusable indefinitely. But there is something deeper happening. A stereotype can become self-sustaining. Once people expect Nigerians to be associated with fraud, a Nigerian fraud story feels particularly relevant. That relevance increases attention. Attention increases circulation. Circulation increases familiarity. And familiarity reinforces the original expectation. The cycle continues. But we also have to confront something uncomfortable from the Nigerian side. A stereotype cannot survive entirely on external perception, if there is nothing in reality for it to attach itself to. That means changing the narrative requires more than complaining about unfair coverage. It requires reducing the underlying criminal activity. It requires stronger institutions, better enforcement, greater digital literacy, economic opportunity, and Nigerians themselves refusing to excuse criminality simply because it embarrasses the country. Because the goal isn't to prove that Nigeria is perfect. Nigeria isn't perfect. No country is. The goal is to establish something much more reasonable. A country's problems should be measured by evidence, not converted into the character of its people. So perhaps the question isn't simply, why does the stereotype persist? Perhaps the bigger question is, who benefits when a stereotype becomes permanent? Who gets attention? Who gets clicks? Who gets political leverage? Who gets commercial opportunity? Who gets to define the story? And perhaps most importantly, who loses when millions of people are reduced to a label? That is where our investigation goes next. Now we can see the mechanism operating in its simplest form. It begins with something real. A scam gets media coverage. That's not necessarily a problem. Crime should be reported. Victims deserve attention. Criminal networks should be exposed. But then something changes. The crime becomes attached to a national identity. The word Nigerian starts appearing alongside the story. Over time, that association becomes a mental shortcut. And once the shortcut exists, something interesting happens. The next Nigerian scam story becomes easier to notice. It feels immediately relevant. It confirms something the audience already thinks it knows. And that new story then reinforces the shortcut. The loop feeds itself. Crime produces coverage. Coverage produces association. Association produces attention. Attention produces more memorable examples. And those examples strengthen the association. Then the cycle begins again. Look carefully at the final sentence on this slide. At no point does this loop require anyone to check the current data. That is the critical weakness. The loop can continue, even if the underlying reality changes. Crime rates can fall. Criminal networks can change tactics. Technology can change. The composition of offenders can change. Millions of Nigerians can continue living completely ordinary, productive lives. But the stereotype can remain, because the stereotype is no longer being maintained by current evidence. It is being maintained by memory, repetition, and expectation. This is how a historical association can outlive the conditions that created it. And there is an even more important point. The loop doesn't require a conspiracy. It doesn't require every journalist to be biased. It doesn't require everyone involved to consciously discriminate. It can emerge from completely ordinary human and media behavior. Journalists report unusual events. Audiences remember dramatic stories. Algorithms reward engagement. People share familiar narratives. And eventually, a national label becomes attached to a criminal category. But once that happens, we have to ask a much harder question. What would it take to break the loop? Because if repetition created the stereotype, simply producing one positive story won't be enough. If the association has been built over decades, changing it requires something equally powerful. Evidence, repetition, visibility, and a sustained alternative narrative. And that is where this investigation becomes bigger than debunking a stereotype. It becomes a question of who gets to define what Nigeria means. Up to this point, we've been talking about other people, other people's assumptions, other people's stereotypes, other people's media, other people's biases. But there is a problem if we leave it there, because confirmation bias is not something that only affects people who stereotype Nigerians. It affects all of us. So I want you to turn the lens inward for a moment. Think about a country you've never visited, a people you've never personally known, a religion you don't practice, a neighborhood you've never lived in, a group you've only encountered through television, social media, films, or headlines. Now ask yourself, what do I believe about them? And then ask the more uncomfortable question. How much of that belief have I actually verified? Perhaps you believe a particular country is dangerous. Perhaps you believe another country is corrupt. Perhaps you think a particular nationality is dishonest. Perhaps you think a certain group is lazy, violent, wealthy, poor, intelligent, or untrustworthy. But where did that belief come from? Personal experience? Research? Statistics? Or simply repetition? Maybe it came from your parents. Maybe from school. Maybe from television. Maybe from social media. Maybe from one memorable experience that your brain quietly turned into a general rule. And this is the point of the entire exercise. We cannot demand that the world examine its assumptions about Nigeria, while refusing to examine our own assumptions about everybody else. That would be the same intellectual mistake wearing different clothes. So don't use this question to think about somebody else's prejudice. Use it on yourself. Which of your own beliefs about a place or a people have you never actually checked? And if you discover one, don't immediately replace it with the opposite belief. Investigate it. Look for the data. Look for competing explanations. Look for evidence that contradicts you. Because intellectual freedom isn't the ability to believe whatever we want. It is the ability to change what we believe when the evidence demands it. Keep that question with you. Because in the next section, we're going to apply exactly the same standard to one of the biggest claims surrounding Nigeria. And this time, we're going to bring the numbers. At this point, we need to make an important correction to the conversation. This is not uniquely Nigerian. The mechanism we have been examining appears in many societies. The names change, the crimes change, the historical circumstances change, but the basic process can remain remarkably similar. A real association emerges. The association receives attention. The attention is repeated. The repetition becomes a stereotype. And the stereotype eventually becomes shorthand for an entire group. Take Italian Americans and organized crime. There was a genuine history of organized criminal organizations, involving some Italian and Sicilian immigrants and their descendants. But cinema and television transformed that history into something much larger. The mafia became a cultural archetype, so much so that for generations, Italian-American identity could be casually connected with organized crime, even though the overwhelming majority of Italian Americans had nothing to do with it. Now consider Colombia and the imagery surrounding drug cartels. Again, the underlying criminal history was real. But the association became so powerful that the image of Colombia itself became entangled with cocaine and cartels. That is why Colombia has spent years deliberately presenting a different national story to international audiences. We will return to that in a later episode. Then there is the relationship between Muslims and terrorism. There have been Muslim terrorist organizations and individuals who have committed horrific acts. That reality must not be denied. But research has also examined how Muslims and terrorism have been represented in news coverage relative to the actual distribution of terrorism cases. And that distinction matters. Because we are learning a broader lesson, a real problem can coexist with an exaggerated stereotype. Those two things are not contradictory. This is important for our Nigerian case, because it prevents us from making a mistake in the opposite direction. We are not saying other groups have stereotypes, therefore Nigerian crime doesn't matter. That's not the argument. The argument is, if we want to understand Nigeria fairly, we need to use the same analytical standard we would apply to everyone else. We should acknowledge the crime, measure it, compare it, understand its history, then examine how that reality became attached to national identity. Because once you see this pattern operating across different groups, one thing becomes difficult to ignore. The stereotype is not the same thing as the underlying population. And that distinction is the foundation of everything that follows. Nigeria isn't alone in carrying a label. The real question is, what happens when a nation decides it is time to rewrite the label? We have now reached the point where we can put the two case studies side by side. On one side, mental illness. On the other, 419/Nigeria. Different subject. Different history. Different evidence. But look carefully at the pattern. First, there is an association. Then the association receives attention. Then it is repeated. Then repetition creates familiarity. And eventually, familiarity begins to look like reality. In the mental health example, public perception of violence can substantially exceed what the underlying evidence suggests. In the Nigerian case, the story is different. There is a genuine history of advance fee fraud and Nigerian involvement in some forms of organized fraud. But a historical association can evolve into something much broader, a global stereotype about an entire nationality. That distinction matters. We should not pretend that 419 was invented by the media. It wasn't. We should not pretend that Nigerians have never participated in fraud. They have. The more interesting question is, how did a real criminal phenomenon become a shorthand for an entire people? Look at the final row. Persists despite counter-evidence. That's the critical idea. Once a stereotype becomes established, evidence contradicting it doesn't necessarily make the stereotype disappear. A Nigerian doctor doesn't erase the stereotype. A Nigerian scientist doesn't erase it. A Nigerian entrepreneur doesn't erase it. Millions of ordinary Nigerians living honest lives don't erase it. Because those examples aren't necessarily entering the same information system. The criminal story is memorable. The stereotype is repeatable. And the ordinary reality is largely invisible. But there is an important lesson here for us as Nigerians too. We cannot simply say, the stereotype is false. We need to ask a harder question. What part of it is true? What part is exaggerated? And what part has been constructed by repetition? That is a much more intellectually honest position. And it protects us from falling into the same trap we are criticizing. Because our objective isn't to create an anti-Western stereotype to replace an anti-Nigerian one. It is to develop a better way of understanding crime. Individual behavior should not automatically become national character. And a handful of highly visible cases should not automatically become a statistical description of millions of people. So this synthesis gives us the framework for the rest of the series. Separate the crime from the nationality. Separate the headline from the data. Separate repetition from evidence. And then ask the question that really matters. Does the label describe reality? Or has reality been reshaped by the label? We have now established something important. The association exists. The crimes exist. The history exists. But we have also seen that perception can become much larger than the underlying reality. So we arrive at the question that matters most. Why does the label persist? If the evidence is available, if millions of Nigerians clearly contradict the stereotype, if the world has changed dramatically since the early days of 419, why does the association remain so powerful? There isn't one simple answer. Part of it is memory. People remember emotionally powerful stories. Part of it is repetition. Once an association becomes familiar, every new example can reinforce it. Part of it is popular culture. The Nigerian prince has moved beyond fraud and become a global joke. And part of it is digital persistence. Old stories don't disappear. They remain searchable, shareable, and reusable indefinitely. But there is something deeper happening. A stereotype can become self-sustaining. Once people expect Nigerians to be associated with fraud, a Nigerian fraud story feels particularly relevant. That relevance increases attention. Attention increases circulation. Circulation increases familiarity. And familiarity reinforces the original expectation. The cycle continues. But we also have to confront something uncomfortable from the Nigerian side. A stereotype cannot survive entirely on external perception, if there is nothing in reality for it to attach itself to. That means changing the narrative requires more than complaining about unfair coverage. It requires reducing the underlying criminal activity. It requires stronger institutions, better enforcement, greater digital literacy, economic opportunity, and Nigerians themselves refusing to excuse criminality simply because it embarrasses the country. Because the goal isn't to prove that Nigeria is perfect. Nigeria isn't perfect. No country is. The goal is to establish something much more reasonable. A country's problems should be measured by evidence, not converted into the character of its people. So perhaps the question isn't simply, why does the stereotype persist? Perhaps the bigger question is, who benefits when a stereotype becomes permanent? Who gets attention? Who gets clicks? Who gets political leverage? Who gets commercial opportunity? Who gets to define the story? And perhaps most importantly, who loses when millions of people are reduced to a label? That is where our investigation goes next. Now we can see the mechanism operating in its simplest form. It begins with something real. A scam gets media coverage. That's not necessarily a problem. Crime should be reported. Victims deserve attention. Criminal networks should be exposed. But then something changes. The crime becomes attached to a national identity. The word Nigerian starts appearing alongside the story. Over time, that association becomes a mental shortcut. And once the shortcut exists, something interesting happens. The next Nigerian scam story becomes easier to notice. It feels immediately relevant. It confirms something the audience already thinks it knows. And that new story then reinforces the shortcut. The loop feeds itself. Crime produces coverage. Coverage produces association. Association produces attention. Attention produces more memorable examples. And those examples strengthen the association. Then the cycle begins again. Look carefully at the final sentence on this slide. At no point does this loop require anyone to check the current data. That is the critical weakness. The loop can continue, even if the underlying reality changes. Crime rates can fall. Criminal networks can change tactics. Technology can change. The composition of offenders can change. Millions of Nigerians can continue living completely ordinary, productive lives. But the stereotype can remain, because the stereotype is no longer being maintained by current evidence. It is being maintained by memory, repetition, and expectation. This is how a historical association can outlive the conditions that created it. And there is an even more important point. The loop doesn't require a conspiracy. It doesn't require every journalist to be biased. It doesn't require everyone involved to consciously discriminate. It can emerge from completely ordinary human and media behavior. Journalists report unusual events. Audiences remember dramatic stories. Algorithms reward engagement. People share familiar narratives. And eventually, a national label becomes attached to a criminal category. But once that happens, we have to ask a much harder question. What would it take to break the loop? Because if repetition created the stereotype, simply producing one positive story won't be enough. If the association has been built over decades, changing it requires something equally powerful: evidence, repetition, visibility, and a sustained alternative narrative. And that is where this investigation becomes bigger than debunking a stereotype. It becomes a question of who gets to define what Nigeria means. We began this episode with a very simple question: can an entire nation be judged by the actions of a minority? Now I want to turn that question around. Imagine we applied the same logic consistently to every nationality. If one Nigerian criminal can become evidence about Nigerians, then one American criminal should become evidence about Americans. One British criminal should become evidence about Britain. One Italian criminal should become evidence about Italians. One Japanese criminal should become evidence about Japan. But immediately we recognize the absurdity. Why? Because we instinctively understand that individual behavior is not the same thing as national character. An American is not responsible for every American criminal. A Briton is not responsible for every British criminal. An Italian is not responsible for the mafia. And a Nigerian should not be responsible for every Nigerian who commits fraud. But there is another question hidden inside this slide. Which crime gets attached to which nationality? If we judged nations by their most notorious criminal organizations, what would happen? Organized crime, drug cartels, financial fraud, human trafficking, cybercrime, corruption, terrorism, corporate crime, war crimes, political corruption. Every country would have something deeply uncomfortable to explain. And that is precisely the point. Crime is not a Nigerian invention. It is a human phenomenon. The forms change, the scale changes, the institutions involved change, but criminality exists across societies. So the intellectually honest question isn't, which nation has criminals? Every nation does. The question is, how much criminality exists? What form does it take? How is it measured? And how representative is it of the population? That is a completely different conversation. And this brings us back to the title of our series, The Nigerian Crime Myth, Beyond the Label. Because labels are convenient. They compress complicated realities into a single word. But reality is almost never that simple. Nigeria has criminals. Nigeria also has millions of people who aren't criminals. Both statements can be true simultaneously. The challenge is refusing to allow one reality to erase the other. So perhaps the fairest standard is also the simplest. Judge criminals as criminals. Judge institutions by their actions. Judge governments by their records. But don't turn the actions of individuals into the character of an entire people. Because if we accept that principle for everyone else, we should be willing to accept it for Nigerians too. And now, we can move from the question of perception to the question of evidence. Before we move toward the conclusion, let's step back and look at what we have actually established. First, stereotypes don't require conspiracy to develop. Confirmation bias and repetition can work together. We notice the information that confirms what we already believe, and repeated exposure makes that information feel increasingly familiar, and therefore increasingly true. No malicious mastermind is required, just human psychology interacting with information systems. Second, the 419 Association has a history. It did not exist from the beginning of Nigerian history. It emerged within a particular historical and economic context, and developed into a recognizable form of fraud. That matters, because it destroys the idea that fraud is somehow an ancient or inherent Nigerian characteristic. A behavior has a history. It has causes. It evolves, and it can change. Third, when we examine actual evidence, the picture becomes considerably more complicated than the stereotype. Criminal networks have become increasingly international. Cybercrime doesn't respect borders. Scammers can operate from one country, target victims in another, use infrastructure in a third, move money through several jurisdictions, and collaborate across nationalities. So asking simply, which nationality are the criminals, can sometimes obscure the much more important question, how does the network actually operate? And finally, we discovered that this mechanism isn't uniquely Nigerian. We saw versions of it surrounding organized crime, mental illness, terrorism, and other national or group stereotypes. The details differ. The underlying psychological mechanism can be remarkably similar, and that gives us perhaps the most important lesson of episode 1. We don't have to choose between two extremes. We don't have to say, Nigeria has no crime, nor do we have to accept, Nigerians are criminals. Both are intellectually lazy. The more difficult position is the more honest one. Nigeria has real criminal problems, but those problems do not automatically define Nigerians. That distinction is where evidence begins. And once you understand the mechanism, you start seeing it everywhere. You begin questioning the headlines. You question the assumptions. You ask what the denominator is. You ask what is missing from the story. And most importantly, you ask, is this actually representative, or is it simply memorable? That is the mindset we take into the next episode. Because now that we understand how the label is built, we're ready to investigate what the numbers actually say. Everything we have discussed in this episode comes back to one principle. Don't ask the audience to believe us. Give them a trail they can follow. That is why this slide matters. We have deliberately separated argument from evidence. The ideas about confirmation bias and media effects are not inventions for this presentation. They come from established research into how people process information and how repeated associations can influence perception. The research on mental illness and violence allows us to examine the difference between public perception and empirical evidence. The historical material on advance fee fraud helps us establish that the 419 phenomenon has a history. It emerged within particular economic and technological circumstances. It wasn't some timeless characteristic of Nigerian identity. And the law enforcement and cybersecurity material allows us to examine how fraud has evolved into an increasingly international phenomenon. That last point is particularly important, because if we are going to challenge the idea that Nigerian crime exists in isolation, we need evidence showing how modern criminal networks actually operate. Cybercrime crosses borders. Money crosses borders. Victims cross borders. Infrastructure crosses borders. And increasingly, criminal networks themselves cross borders. So the question cannot simply be, what nationality was the person arrested? We also need to ask, where was the operation organized? Where were the victims? Where did the money move? What technology was used? Who else was involved? Those questions give us a much more accurate picture of modern crime. I also want to make something clear about our sources. A source appearing on this slide doesn't mean every claim associated with it should be accepted without question. Sources themselves must be examined. What did the researchers actually measure? What period did they study? What population did they examine? What are the limitations? And can the finding legitimately be applied to the claim we're making? That is what evidence-based storytelling requires. So this is more than a bibliography. It is the paper trail behind the argument. If you disagree with our conclusion, that's fine. But don't simply disagree with the conclusion. Follow the evidence, read the research, check the methodology, challenge the interpretation. And if the evidence proves us wrong, then the conclusion should change. Because that is the standard this series is built upon. Not defending Nigeria at all costs. Not attacking anyone at all costs. Following the evidence wherever it leads. We began this series with a simple observation. Say the word Nigerian to a stranger, and for some people, one of the first associations that appears is crime. But today, we have taken that assumption apart. We've looked at how stereotypes are created, how repetition makes claims feel true, and how individual criminal cases can gradually become attached to an entire population. Now we're going to take the next step. We're going to follow the money. Because if we're going to talk honestly about drugs, we need to stop asking only, which nationality is involved? And start asking, where is the market? Where is the supply? Where is the money? Who controls the routes? Who profits? The global drug trade is not a story about one country. It is an international system involving producers, traffickers, brokers, distributors, consumers, financial networks, corrupt officials, and legitimate businesses that can sometimes become part of the laundering process. And that creates an uncomfortable question. If Nigerians are repeatedly portrayed as the face of international drug crime, what does the actual global evidence tell us? Who produces the drugs? Who moves them? Who consumes the largest quantities? Which countries are major trafficking hubs? Where are the profits ultimately accumulated? And perhaps most importantly, who gets named in the headlines, and who disappears behind the structure? We will also examine something else, the difference between participating in a criminal market and being responsible for the criminal market itself. Those are not the same thing. A Nigerian individual committing a crime is responsible for that crime. But that individual does not become evidence that 230 million Nigerians are criminals. The same principle must apply everywhere. So this episode will not be an exercise in replacing one stereotype with another. We are not going to say Nigeria isn't responsible, therefore another nationality must be. That would simply reproduce the same flawed thinking. Instead, we're going to map the system. Countries, routes, markets, money, institutions, evidence, and then ask a question that is much harder to dismiss. If crime is global, Why do we keep giving it a nationality? Next, we look at who really runs the drug trade. Because once you follow the money, the story gets considerably more complicated. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.